Thank you for joining us on this episode of the General Counselling Podcast from Montresor Legal. Since we started Montresor 8 years ago, our best intelligence has come from bringing our private practice and in-house networks together. That is what the General Counselling Podcast is all about. A leader from business with a law firm partner sharing their insights on the latest issues across the legal landscape. We've got some brilliant episodes coming up on well-being and mental health, private equity and global energy. So hit subscribe. We'd love you to spread the word by sharing the podcast to your LinkedIn network, or if that's a bit much, just hit like. Today's episode is covering structured finance or securitization. Which is it? I should probably get our guests to clear that one up. It's been a bit of a roller coaster for the structured finance market over the last 10 years. From being a popular scapegoat as a key contributor to the global financial crisis in 2009, written off by many as permanently over as an industry, the structured finance market went on to record a stellar 5 years, re-emerging from the ashes of the GFC to become once again a key strategy for modern businesses to raise money and a popular asset class with a wide range of investors, from pension funds to private equity. Now, I know I always say this, but I'm particularly excited with our guests on today's episode. Two lawyers at the top of their games within structured finance, both of whom I'm sure wouldn't mind me pointing out, have seen the market from the credit crunch through to COVID. From the in-house world, we have Francesca Segurini. Francesca spent 10 years at Clifford Chance before joining Herbert Smith's structured finance practice and is now a legal director supporting the structured finance business at a major European investment bank. From private practice, we're joined by John Goldfinch. John is a partner in the alternative investments practice at Milbank in London, where he's also chair of their diversity and inclusion committee. John and partner James Warby have built one of the premier structured finance franchises in London, and he's rated as a leading lawyer by every major directory, as well as a rising star by the International Financial Law Review. Thank you both for joining us. It's great to have you on General Counselling.
Good
In
morning,
the next
Tom.
30 minutes or so, we'll cover what's happening in the structured finance market, careers advice, John and Francesca's goats, but let's kick off with our usual starter for 10, COVID. So John, how's
Morning,
2020
Tom.
treated the structured finance market?
So you were kind enough to send this question in advance, so I gave it some thought. And I actually think that this is more a story about how the structured finance market has weathered the pandemic very robustly, rather than what are the most significant impacts. Yes, it's true that if we go back to March, there was a big dip in market values across the board, across every asset class, which certainly knocked investor confidence. And this is a market that thrives on and needs investor confidence in order to function. So there was undoubtedly a big knock there that has impacted issuance volumes in the capital market side of the structured finance space particularly. And it's true also that as companies have become distressed, there's also been a lot of ratings pressure on the underlying assets that structured finance deals rely on. But if you think about the performance of the deals themselves, much like in the global financial crisis of 2008 and subsequently, the deals themselves have actually performed extremely robustly. They are designed to react to exactly this kind of scenario. It's now true that, more recently, March seems like a hell of a long time ago now, that pricing of particularly the securitizations that we work on has now come into levels. The mean issuance levels are getting very busy. Francesca, I'm sure, will have a view on this as well, but I think by the time we get to the end of the year, maybe this won't be the biggest year ever for issuance, but certainly it will be very healthy. So I actually think that structured finance as an asset class, as a practice area, has weathered the pandemic extremely well.
Francesca, what's your view from sitting inside a bank?
So my view is that, different asset classes have been affected in different ways. Different sectors have been affected in different ways. Obviously we can all imagine what sectors have been most affected by this. Sectors like aviation, hospitality have been under particular pressure. I think there is a difference in the structured finance space between the public and the private market. The two don't act in the same way. I think the public market is a lot more volatile. But I think the main thing for me is that the real impact still needs to work through the system. There has been a plethora of different government support schemes across the world that have somewhat dampened the effects of the COVID crisis. And I think it will be something that we need to keep an eye on is what happens when these government support schemes start to step down and what effect this will have on the deals, on either existing deals or new deals. And I'm quite optimistic, like John is. I think these deals are designed to weather these kinds of storms, but I think they probably haven't been completely tested yet.
That's a very fair and thoughtful comment. I certainly agree with that view. There is a bit of a sort of delayed reaction because of the, well, frankly, life support schemes that have been put in place, particularly in Europe. If you compare and contrast with the US, I think things have hit a bit harder and faster there. And you can just tell that from looking at the relative busyness levels of, for example, my bankruptcy colleagues. So I certainly agree with that, Francesca.
And so do you, in terms of the outlook as we go into 2021, I've been surprised from the guests we've had on general counselling and the people we speak to, how confident people are that the market will continue to operate as usual. But there are obviously some underlying things that people are worried about. But then they don't seem yet to be, if you look at the profitability of a lot of law firms who are doing this transactional work, that, White & Case posted 40% profitability, I think, across the board last week. That they don't seem yet to be hitting law firms. Francesca, what's your view on how the performance of structured finance is going to fare over the course of the next 12 months as we hopefully come out of the COVID crisis?
So I think it's going to continue to be busy. Structured finance as a funding tool has proven that it's very effective and very useful. And, I know we're going to talk about the financial crisis, the last financial crisis, a little bit later on, but I definitely think, it has proven its utility over the years. And I think, the concept of asset-backed financing is still going to have a place going forward, and probably particularly so where there is turbulence in other parts of the market. So I remain confident and upbeat that we are going to continue to be busy over the next year or so. I hope that I will be proved correct.
That actually segues quite nicely onto more my next question, which is going to be why structured finance did take quite a public beating in the aftermath of the CDO crisis and other areas during the GFC. John, why is it important? Why should we care about the structured finance market and its relative health?
Yeah, and we can talk a bit about later about the inaccurate reporting that the press put out about our industry, which is still a bit of a bugbear for me today. But if you think about structured finance and securitization particularly, although actually it encompasses the entire asset class, is a vital source of funding for the economy. I mean, if you think just about the loan securitization market, which is a tiny part of the overall securitization market, CLOs, the actual loan securitization vehicles themselves, make up roughly 2/3 of the lenders in every leverage loan. Not a lot of people know that. People assume that when a bank syndicates out a loan, it tends to stick with the banks. But if you think that 2/3 of leverage loans, which are the loans that are being provided to particularly mid-sized businesses all across Europe, loan securitization is providing 2/3 of that funding. So the real economy is, entirely dependent on a properly functioning securitization market in particularly, but also structured finance market more broadly. And as Francesca pointed out earlier, that's both in the public markets and privately. Without that functioning asset class, the real economy cannot itself function.
Francesca, over to you. Why do you see structured finance as an important sector for the wider economy?
Yeah, I would agree with what John just said. It is vital that sectors are able to make their assets work for them. And, you know, if you have a loan or if you have a multitude of loans, the ability to monetize the value of these loans and get access to funding for them is incredibly important. And the tools that we use in structured finance have withstood quite a few testing moments. And, you know, as John said earlier, I think we got a lot of bad press in the last crisis. But if you look at European deals in particular, they ended up, the public European deals ended up performing quite well. You know, prime UK residential mortgages performed well throughout the crisis. So I think that perhaps in the last crisis, there was a little bit, you know, obviously there were some problems with the industry, and I think a lot of work has been done since to address those through regulation, through changes in attitude, and we're in a much better and more robust place now. But fundamentally, I think what we've shown is that this is an important funding tool for the economy as a whole, and that without it, the economy as a whole is going to suffer.
And John, you mentioned a frustration with in particular, the press media coverage of the structured finance industry during the last crisis. How does this crisis compare in your eyes, and why do you think structured finance has come through it as effectively as it has?
Sure. Well, in many ways, although they're both crises, I actually don't think that they're that comparable. 2008 and thereabouts was a credit crisis. The fear of economic contagion meant banks wouldn't lend to each other, and that had knock-on effects for the entire industry and the economy. What we're facing now is a health crisis that the response to which has caused an economic crisis. There's no shortage of liquidity in the market in the way that we saw in 2008. There's plenty of money to be lent and deals to be done. So they are crises, but the causes of them are entirely different. Now, I talked a little bit earlier about investor confidence. Of course, the similarity is that the impact of both of these crises has dented investor confidence, and that impacts, but in particular, the capital markets in exactly the same way. So that is the similarity. But I don't really think that the two are comparable. It is absolutely true that some quite storied publications, whose names I will not mention, reported on, in particular, the securitization market in what I felt was quite an inaccurate way, whether for journalistic, well, they're trying to sell newspapers, right? But the industry became demonized in a way that I thought was unfair, and some of the coverage was a little bit frustrating, overlooking the real role that the structured finance market plays in funding the real economy, as we talked about earlier. That hasn't happened this time, of course, because we're just not in the spotlight, because the market has just continued to function and to do what we have been doing all along. So there is a difference, I suppose.
Francesca, there probably were some actors within the GFC that were deserving of criticism from the industry. What elements
of the mortgage securitization market, certain participants therein, yes, that is absolutely true. But of course, what that meant was the entire industry got tainted, perhaps unfairly.
Yeah.
But yes, undoubtedly there were some bad practices, which, as Francesca noted, regulators have responded to quite robustly. And I promise not to mention risk retention, so I've just said it. But things of that nature mean that the market is a lot healthier, and the likelihood of that kind of behaviour occurring again is greatly reduced.
I think it's interesting when, regulation obviously is not the type of topic that is going to get people turning onto your podcast in their droves, but at the same time, I think they get a lot of heat when it goes badly, but they don't get very much praise when it goes well. And actually, some of the regulations looked at in the round seem to have meant that the market operates more effectively than it did in the past.
I absolutely agree with that. It's a bit like the security services, right? We only hear about their failures, not their successes.
Francesca, one of the things that a lot of
I don't know, John, how you...
Sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Hey, John, I don't know how you feel, but on a personal level, it's been quite a relief not to be in the eye of the storm this time.
That's a fair comment, yeah, and definitely a difference from 2008.
You can say what you do at dinner parties again, which must be quite nice. One of the things that we get a lot of people commenting on structured finance is it is a technical area. You know, some of the deals are, you know, huge, great document wedges, and they can be quite technical. Francesca, what's the most fun thing about practicing as a structured finance lawyer?
I think probably without a doubt, it's the people. And, you know, you have to be really collaborative. You have to work in these big teams. You often work long hours. The deals are complicated. They're intellectually challenging. And it's often done under a lot of time pressure. So I think the thing that makes it all bearable is the people that you surround yourself with, and the fact that, you know, it can be made fun, and you have a sense of achievement and camaraderie at the end of the day that that is a real boost, and that has kept me in the industry for 20 years now.
Yeah, certainly the people I've come across, you know, and all, you know, whether they're lawyers or business professionals, they tend to be some pretty bright and some quite fun people within structured finance. John, what about you? What's the best thing about?
I certainly agree with Francesca's thoughts there. It's a very creative practice area, and what that means is that the people that we work with, be they clients, colleagues, other lawyers, tend to be very thoughtful individuals and a pleasure to work with. The only thing I'd add to Francesca's answer there is that it is also the variety that you get in the practice area. You're doing something different every day. There's always a new structure, a different type of deal. There's always a new regulation to think about. There's always something different that the client wants to achieve. Even if you do what is one might think of as a repeat deal, there's really no such thing as a repeat deal in structured finance. There's always something new to wrestle with, and I think it is that variety that keeps it interesting.
So moving on to the next topic, which is careers advice. You know, you guys have both had careers that I think anyone who is a junior lawyer or a junior partner would look at and be interested in emulating. The first question we ask is to our partner, what in their view makes a great in-house lawyer? And then Francesca, I'll move on to you in a sec to ask you what you think makes a great private practice lawyer. But John, yeah, what in your view makes someone a really effective in-house lawyer within?
Yeah, no. So I have great respect for the in-house role, which has become a lot harder, I think, over the years. What makes a great in-house lawyer, I think, is firstly and fundamentally a really deep understanding of the business that they are working with. You effectively have one client, and you really need to understand their needs first and foremost. What that allows you to do is to then blend a kind of commercial sensitivity with the legal insight that you as the in-house counsel bring to that business, so that they really rely on you as their trusted partner. And you are effectively acting, obviously there is a role for external counsel as well, and a good in-house lawyer will identify when that external role is needed. But it's that interposition of the business understanding with the legal knowledge that helps them translate the needs of the business. That's what makes a great in-house lawyer, I think.
And Francesca, when you moved from Herbert Smith in-house, how did you find that transition and being able to develop that level of business understanding that you obviously don't necessarily need so much when you're in as an external counsel?
Yeah, it was quite a steep learning curve, I have to say. I think also I moved quite late. Probably a lot of lawyers move earlier on in their careers. So, I had knowledge of my sector, but I didn't necessarily have knowledge of the inner workings of the banks. And also, I think, even just getting to grips with all the acronyms took a while.
There is the odd
That's
acronym
fair.
in structured finance, that's certainly true. So looking at it from a different perspective, when you're working with a lawyer, when you're working with a partner or an associate within a law firm, what makes it a joy, a pleasurable experience?
So I think it probably boils down, for me personally, I think it probably boils down to three things. The first is availability. So it's great when you have a problem and you can pick up the phone and the partner or the associate that you need to speak to are there at the other end of the phone. The second is knowledge. You really rely on their expertise and their expert knowledge. And the third is partnership, because you are working together, very much together. And I feel very strongly that the relationships with our external law firms need to be really good relationships. They need to be based on mutual respect and an ability to work together effectively. It's in everybody's interest.
That's the key point, isn't it? If you're advising a senior associate or a junior partner, is how you actually develop that partnership and that trust when you're working with someone, especially when you're working with someone whether for the first time or you haven't done huge amounts with them before. Because that comes out again and again when we're speaking to in-house counsel about what they want from availability in some of these bigger firms is a bit of a given sometimes. If you're not available, you're probably not going to get that many repeat deals. And expertise, again, you should, by the time you're operating at partner level, you should really know your stuff. So it's a question of how you develop that early understanding and partnership with the people that you're working with that differentiate you from the rest of the field.
I like that concept of partnering with the client that Francesca drew out there. It is exactly how I think about it as well. As external counsel, you're not there to deliver legal advice. You are there to solve problems. And the only way that you can do that is to partner with your client to understand their business, their needs and their issues, and then you can work to solve them. If you just deliver legal advice, you're never going to get very far.
No, and I think you especially see the best advice that you can give young lawyers is, your client's not going to thank you for picking out the most complicated legal problem that you can find and bringing it to their attention.
Exactly
really what they want. But you'd be surprised the number of people that do that and think they're
Oh, it definitely still happens. Yeah.
Looking at the advice you've taken over your careers, John, what's the best bit of careers advice you've been given, and who gave it to you?
I gave this a lot of thought, and I kept coming back to a phrase that actually my partner in the practice now, James Warby, gave to me many years ago. And he said, look, it's much easier to lose a client than gain one. So focus on the work on your desk first. That is the best marketing you will ever do. I think that is excellent advice and worth always bearing in mind.
I think that plays into a bit of advice I was given once, which in business development, which is definitely true, which is you get much more return on investment putting work into the clients you've already got than going after new ones. And I think it takes it on a bit to say you need to make sure that those, relentlessly focus on those clients.
Absolutely.
Getting new ones takes ages and there's a massive pain.
Absolutely agree.
Francesca, how about you? What's the best piece of career advice you've been given and who gave it to you?
So actually, I also gave this some thought. And in the end, I think the most practical piece of advice I was ever given was when I was a third seat trainee by my then supervisor, who told me that I should always send emails with the expectation that they would be read aloud in court.
Yeah.
And, I think that's something that I carried with me for the rest of my career. And it's actually a fantastic piece of advice because, when you're about to send an email in anger, it makes you pause and think again.
Yeah, I received similar advice myself, and in fact have passed on the same. That is invaluable advice. Never send anything in anger. read everything 3 times, and as you say, assume that it's going to be read out to you by somebody else in court, and then think, do you really want to send it?
My mother has a piece of advice, which is if you don't do something unless you think you'd be okay reading about it in the Daily Mail, which I think is probably along a similar line. Perfect. Moving on, we ask every guest who is joining us on the General Counselling podcast who their GOAT lawyer is. And for those of you unfamiliar with sporting anachronisms, GOAT stands for greatest of all time. And we're building a brilliant list of real, fictional, alive or dead lawyers. And I'd like to ask Francesca first, who you nominate?
I'm for a very obvious and very topical response to that, and I'm going to say Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And I think it's partly because of her inspirational work in civil rights in the US and beyond that have had a huge impact on the way that we live our lives at the moment. But also because it made me reflect on a couple of things. One is how much the legal profession has changed for women over the past 50 years or so. Now at entry level, it's 50-50. It reminded me also that there's probably still work to be done. But collectively, I think we also need to remember that we have a responsibility to make things better for the next generation of lawyers coming through. And that, in the same way that doors were held open by us by the previous generation, we need to do the same for the generation coming through. And, I also find you can't say that people are iconic very easily, but Ruth Bader Ginsburg is, I think, an absolute icon.
I think you hear some of the stories. I mean, she's one of those people that probably people in the UK were familiar with if they were quite politically engaged. But after she died, obviously, she became almost pretty much a household name, even outside legal circles. And some of the stories about, being able to wear trousers or not, it seems like it wasn't that long ago. But then you realize it was, actually in a number of years, it wasn't that long ago.
Yeah.
And as you say, that is only our second nomination of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So I think she's someone that we expected when we launched this to get quite a few shouts. So that's great. John, how about you? Who's your GOAT?
So the way I thought about this was to cast my mind back over my own career, because I've had the fortune to work with some incredibly talented lawyers over the years, and I sort of struggled to pick out any one individual, and it would almost be sort of unfair to do so. So let me answer your question with an anecdote, and then I will give you my greatest lawyer of all time. When I went to college, you had to go for an interview first, and one of the first questions the tutor asked me was, why do you want to read law? And I answered very flippantly. I said, well, obviously John Grisham and Ally McBeal, which actually was the true answer, because I devoured those books and those TV shows and thought, oh, actually that looks like a fantastic career. Obviously things turned out slightly differently. And the tutor wasn't very impressed by this answer, as you might imagine. He said, well, what is the real answer? And I had to sort of do a double take and come up with something very quickly. They did actually then make me an offer, so hopefully that was thoughtful. But the individual who was interviewing me was called Michael Spence. He then went on to become the master of that college and head of the law faculty. He's now moved to Melbourne in Australia. I picked him because for a man with an intellect the size of a planet, he was incredibly thoughtful and humble, provided a lot of advice to me over the years, not only in the legal sphere, but in the personal sphere as well. And I owe a lot to how he taught me to think about issues and problems, not only legally, but more broadly than that as well. And I wish him well and hope that he is doing well. But if I were to pick one person right at the beginning of my career who set me on the right course, Mr. Michael Spence would be the guy.
Well, if he still has a LinkedIn account in Melbourne, Australia, we'll make sure we flick him a recording of the podcast so he can take the kudos. I think
he'll be terribly embarrassed, but
the number of lawyers I speak to, I think you can chart it by generation. When I first came into the industry in 2001, everyone got into legal because they liked LA law, and then as it moved Ally McBeal, and then later on, I think it'll be Suits for the new lot. I think they probably, I missed the Ally McBeal that covered the loan securitization market, but I would have been interesting to see how they treated it.
Yeah, there probably aren't that many parallels, but
well, they would have probably done something fun with it. But look, that is it for our Structured Finance episode. Just left to say a big thank you to John and Francesca. I hope we'll both get to, you'll get to join us again at some point future. Thank you everyone for listening. Please do subscribe, maybe a gentle like on LinkedIn, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode.
thank you for inviting us.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.